So I want to talk to you today about something that has become really popular to talk about these days, even you could say faddish, and that is the phenomenon of gaslighting. And what I want to show you is that gaslighting is a tale as old as time, and it has been recognized for a very long time. So first, let's start with what gaslighting is and what it isn't. So the Cleveland Clinic, and I'll have a link to this in the notes, the Cleveland Clinic describes gaslighting in the following way. It says that popularly it can be confused with things like lying, guilt-tripping, and shaming. Okay, but these actually are tactics that can be used within gaslighting, but gaslighting is something else. It is not specifically those things. So the definition that the Cleveland Clinic provides is as follows, quote, "In truth, people use these tactics and more to gaslight their targets over long periods in an effort to gain power and control over them." Now, that's key. Power and control, repetitive behavior. Okay, to continue, quote, "But it's specifically the pattern of repetitive behavior that's used to deteriorate someone's morality, sanity, and sense of self that fundamentally defines gaslighting abuse." As you can imagine, this is very subtle. So I want to focus on two things in particular as we look at gaslighting. And those two things are our very basic emotional desire for power. All of us have this, I would argue, to some extent. And an emotional desire for preservation. And oftentimes fear leads to that desire for self-preservation. So as long as there exist these emotional desires for power and self-preservation, there is going to be gaslighting behavior, I would argue. So what I want to spend most of the time talking to you about is gaslighting in The Lord of the Rings. So Tolkien knew all about gaslighting, and that will become very evident as we discuss this. You know, whether he would have used that word or not is a different story, but he knows all about this. So I want to give you three examples that he puts into his stories of gaslighting. One is actually from a hero who engages in gaslighting. Another is naturally a villain, and the other is sort of this, this ultimate gaslighter. So after that, I'll mention a couple of examples from the Bible, and then also something from relatively recent history, and we'll conclude by thinking about what this means for you and how you can apply these things to your life in a way that's helpful for you. So as I get into these examples from the Lord of the Rings, let me just say that as I've been reading through Lord of the Rings recently, there are just places in here where I'm just floored, and it reminds me of a conversation I heard recently where someone was talking about this influential professor who told pre-med students, if you want to be a good doctor, you really need to read good novels. Now, why in the world, to be a good doctor, would you read good novels? And this professor, professor of English literature, as you can imagine, said, well, if you want to be a good doctor, you need to understand people, and good novels will help you do that. And so Lord of the Rings is very much like that. But let me get to the first example. As I mentioned, this first example is a hero of sorts. He is Boromir, and he shows up in the Fellowship of the Ring and the first part of the Two Towers. So first instance that we see that I'll show you of Boromir gaslighting is when he shows up in the story at the Council of Elrond. So there's this big council, and they have to decide what to do with the One Ring, this ring of power that is this threat, and so they have to destroy it. Well, Boromir isn't so sure that they have to destroy it. He's like, can't we use this ring if it wields so much power to defeat the enemy? So he starts to question the wisdom of the mission, but everyone sees that Boromir is this valiant man who stands up in Gondor, Minas Tirith, this kingdom of men, so he's a valuable part of the journey. There's a famous meme that you've probably heard about where Boromir, in the movie version, he holds his hand up, and one does not simply walk into Mordor, and that's been made into all kinds of other things. But there's, as funny as that is, there's a good reason why that's a meme, because we often have this sort of reaction of like, no, you just don't do this. And what he's doing is he's trying to tell them, this is ridiculous. One of his favorite words is folly. It's folly to do this. So they know they have to do this hard, difficult thing. They have to take this path. He calls it folly. He calls it into question. So he's questioning their sanity. Okay, there's another place where the company, the Fellowship, including Boromir and Frodo carrying the ring and everyone else, they come to Lothlorien, and they meet this elf named Galadriel, and Galadriel is played by Cate Blanchett in the movies, and she's regal and mysterious and beautiful and pure, and she ends up looking in the book into the eyes of each member of the Fellowship, and no one can hold her gaze except Aragorn and Legolas. Now, Gandalf isn't there at this point, but Legolas and Aragorn can hold her gaze, but everyone else feels really uncomfortable. There's this interesting place afterward where Sam says, I felt, he blushes, and he's like, I felt like I was naked in front of her. And so he has this humble sense of his own, nakedness, his own insufficiencies, and all this, but he's able to recognize it. Boromir is not like that. Boromir is filled with pride. He's valiant, and he definitely questions this. So I'll read you just something of what he says. He says, "To me, it seemed exceedingly strange. Maybe it was only a test, and she thought to read our thoughts for her own good purpose. But almost I should have said that she was tempting us, and offering what she pretended to have the power to give. It need not be said that I refused to listen. The men of Minas Tirith are true to their word." But what he thought that the lady had offered him, Boromir did not tell. And the reader, of course, knows that she is putting this thought in his mind, she's not putting it there, it's there, she's bringing it out, that he has this desire for the ring. And so Boromir questions that. He questions the morality of her. He thinks she's actually tempting him, when really she's just bringing up something that exists within him. So you can see him starting to try to distort reality. You can also see the sense in which he's justifying himself by the group that he's part of. Men of Minas Tirith aren't like this, thank you very much. So he starts to try to protect that and defend that, and we'll see that that really is behind gaslighting in all kinds of ways. Okay, so as the company gets ready to leave from Lothlorien, there's another scene with Boromir, and he says this. He says, "I shall go to Minas Tirith alone if need be." There's some question whether they should go to Minas Tirith or take the straighter route toward Mordor to destroy the ring. He says, "I shall go to Minas Tirith alone if need be, for it is my duty," said Boromir. And after that he was silent for a while, sitting with his eyes fixed on Frodo, as if he was trying to read the halfling's thoughts. At length he spoke again softly, as if he was debating with himself. "If you wish only to destroy the ring," he said, "then there is little use in war and weapons, and the men of Minas Tirith cannot help. But if you wish to destroy the armed might of the Dark Lord, then it is folly to go without force into his domain, and folly to throw away." He paused suddenly, as if he had become aware that he was speaking his thoughts aloud. "It would be folly to throw lives away, I mean," he ended. "It is a choice between defending a strong place and walking openly into the arms of death. At least, that is how I see it." You can see how he's sort of spinning his version of reality, and yet he feels that he was caught in saying something in his own reflections. The text continues, "Frodo caught something new and strange in Boromir's glance, and he looked hard at him. Plainly, Boromir's thought was different from his final words. It would be folly to throw away. What? The ring of power? He had said something like this at the council, but then he had accepted the correction of Elrond. Frodo looked at Aragorn, but he seemed deep in his own thought and made no sign that he had heeded Boromir's words. So Boromir's debating, he's giving these signs, he even sort of throws out this idea, well, at least this is my opinion, but he's trying to distort what people need to do. But at the same time, at the end there, you see Aragorn, and he is kind of giving no mind to this. He's consumed in his own thoughts of the right thing to do, and really, I think Aragorn is not bothered by the distortions of Boromir. Now, a lot more could be said about that, but let's move on. Probably the greatest instance of gaslighting from Boromir comes when they finally get to a decision point. Frodo's got to make up his mind whether he's going to go with them to Minas Tirith, and the ring would, come into the power of men, and it would seem wise, in a sense, to protect it there, but there's also the straighter path to Mordor, and as you can imagine, that's the more difficult but wiser course. And I just want to, there's so much here. There's in the movie, it's not as long as in the book, but Boromir tries to gaslight Frodo, and I just want to pick up in the middle of their conversation. So Boromir says of the ring, "And they tell us to throw it away," he cried. "I do not say destroy it. That might be well, if reason could show any hope of doing so. It does not. The only plan that is proposed to us is that a halfling should walk blindly into Mordor and offer the enemy every chance of recapturing it for himself. Folly! Surely you see it, my friend," he said, turning now suddenly to Frodo again. "You say that you are afraid. If it is so, the boldest should pardon you. But is it not really your good sense that revolts?" "No, I am afraid," said Frodo, "simply afraid. But I am glad to have heard you speak so fully. My mind is clearer now." Boromir then goes on as Frodo explains what he meant by that statement. And Boromir says, "Why are you so unfriendly?" You can see Boromir is trying to question Frodo's sanity in taking the course to Mordor. He is trying to question his sense of self. He is a halfling, and halflings don't belong on these journeys. Whereas Boromir, he says he's the bravest, he's valiant, and so he should be trusted. And there at the end, he questions Frodo's morality. You're actually unfriendly. So when someone stands their ground against a gaslighter, often they're questioned and their morality is put into question. So, lots of stuff there. And what I want to highlight here, as I started with, gaslighting happens as long as there exists in the human heart an emotional desire for power and an emotional desire for self-preservation. Oftentimes, those who have a strong sense of self-preservation, like Frodo, a halfling, they're the ones who have to see in the person of power, like, I can see that you're valiant, I can see the value that you bring, but I just don't have to listen to this. That's ultimately what Aragorn does, I think, as he's able to ignore Boromir's words. Okay, so some concluding thoughts on Boromir that are really important. Boromir ends up, spoiler alert if you don't know the story, he ends up confessing that he tried to take the ring from Frodo. He confesses that to Aragorn as he's dying. He's dying because he had died defending two other hobbits, Merry and Pippin, so he does seem to vindicate himself in this way, and that's very important because Boromir is not a villain, but he is a gaslighter. And that, I think, is one of the brilliant things about Tolkien's stories. He shows us our capacity for gaslighting, but he does it by working it into our soul, by giving us a character that perhaps we can relate to in some ways. And by looking at that character, we are able to decide who we would like to be and who we would not like to be, and we're able to see perhaps some of our own tendencies, and we're able to address them. And that is the power of good literature, which works a lot better than me simply telling you, don't be a gaslighter. So, first example is Boromir. Second example is quite different. This is Grima, known as Wormtongue, and he is not a hero in any way. In fact, he's kind of like a Sauron type, a Darth Vader. You know, these characters who just look like a personification of evil. Grima has a pale face, and he's got a long pointed tongue, and he's like the orcs. The orcs bleed black, for goodness sake. So it's just almost not human, and he's this personification of evil. Grima is also very cowardly, and he'll do whatever it takes to survive. So very different from Boromir, but equally as much a gaslighter. Okay, so in the story, Grima comes to Rohan, and he is the advisor to King Theoden at Rohan, and he is Grima is Saruman's puppet. Saruman's this evil wizard, and he is striking fear into Theoden and all his subjects so that they just kind of sink back into this mode of self-preservation, all the while evil is gaining power around them. And so Gandalf and company show up, and they have to do something about this. They have to, bring Theoden back to his sense of sanity, self, and morality, all things that we've seen gaslighters try to diminish. And so in the movie, Gandalf and company come, and they're told that to enter the king's hall, they have to give up their weapons, and they say, well, we'll have to take your staff too, Gandalf. And Gandalf says, well, surely you wouldn't take an old man's staff. And they kind of get in that way. The book is actually much more subtle and much richer than that. So in the book, they come first to the gate to get into to the city. And they come to the gate, and by showing their trustworthiness to the gatekeeper, after talking for a little while, they're able to get in past the gate. But then they have to get in past another guardian, and this is the door ward, who's named Hama in the book. And they have to show their trustworthiness to him. So that's where they're asked to give up their weapons, and there's this long exchange of whether they should, and this also serves to sort of show their trustworthiness. And finally, they do ask for Gandalf's staff, but this is quite different in the book, because in the book, they're not fooled that this is just some old man's staff, as the movie might give you the impression of. But Hama, the door ward of the king, says, "The staff in the hand of a wizard may be more than a prop for age." He looked hard at the ash staff on which Gandalf leaned. "Yet, in doubt, a man of worth will trust to his own wisdom. I believe you are friends and folk worthy of honor who have no evil purpose. You may go in." So Hama becomes key because he knows what a wizard can do with his staff, but though that might seem disruptive, and though Grima would no doubt and will say that's actually Gandalf's evil intent, he'll question his morality, Hama can see, you might end up causing some trouble with that staff, but I can see your heart. And so Hama is really the hero in this exchange because he is able to let Gandalf in. He sees, you might be disrupting things, but I trust that. So, Wormtongue, meanwhile, his repetitive behavior, his counsel that has fed this fear into the king and his kingdom, has been decreasing the king and the kingdom's sense of self and sense of morality. But when a good source shows up to disrupt that, it seems to those who have bought into the gaslighting almost like an evil opposing force. So Okay, let me read to you what happens as Gandalf comes in. Gandalf, of course, is going to use that staff in order to rescue Theoden from the gaslighting of Wormtongue. So, thus Gandalf softly sang, and then suddenly he changed. Casting his tattered cloak aside, he stood up and leaned no longer on his staff, and he spoke in a clear, cold voice. The wise speak only of what they know, Grima, son of Galmod. A witless worm you have become. Therefore be silent, and keep your forked tongue behind your teeth. I have not passed through fire and death to bandy crooked words with a serving man till the lightning falls. He raised his staff. There was a roll of thunder. The sunlight was blotted out from the eastern windows. The whole hall became suddenly dark as night. The fire faded to sullen embers. Only Gandalf could be seen, standing white and tall before the blackened hearth. In the gloom they heard the hiss of Wormtongue's voice. "Did I not counsel you, Lord, to forbid his staff? That fool Hama has betrayed us." So that's exactly the type of gaslighting that Wormtongue had used, but now Gandalf's here and he ain't having it. So Wormtongue makes it seem like Gandalf is up to no good. Okay, well, so we've got the valiant gaslighter Boromir. We've got the really the opposite in every way, Grima, the cowardly, evil gaslighter. And then you have really the ultimate gaslighter in the person of Saruman. Saruman is a wizard. He used to be Saruman the White, a trusted ally of Gandalf. But Saruman turns evil, and he's ultimately defeated in his tower, and I will read what happens, and you can see how, like, gaslighting almost, when someone does it well, it almost seems like magic, and that's why all gaslighting must lead here in the story. So, okay, so the window closed, it says. They waited. Suddenly, another voice spoke. This is the voice of Saruman. It was low and melodious, its very sound an enchantment. Those who listened unwarily to that voice could seldom report the words that they heard, and if they did, they wondered, for little power remained in them. Mostly they remembered only that it was a delight to hear the voice speaking. All that it said seemed wise and reasonable, and desire awoke in them by swift agreement to seem wise themselves. When others spoke, they seemed harsh and uncouth by contrast. You can think of Gandalf there, who seemed that way to Wormtongue. It continues, and if they gainsaid the voice, anger was kindled in the hearts of those under the spell. For some, the spell lasted only while the voice spoke to them, and when it spoke to another, they smiled, as men do who see through a juggler's trick while others gape at it. For many, the sound of the voice alone was enough to hold them enthralled, but for those whom it conquered, the spell endured when they were far away, and ever they heard that soft voice whispering and urging them. But none were unmoved, none rejected its pleas and its commands without an effort of mind and will, so long as its master had control of it. So, if that ain't gaslighting, I don't know what is. A description of gaslighting, that is. With some people, they can actually see when it's spoken to someone next to them. They're like, okay, I see what he's doing to you. Well, you ever thought of that way with someone being gaslighted? At the same time, there's some people who, once they leave, the spell's broken. Other people, it stays with them, and that voice sort of lingers in, and that's what a gaslighter can do. This desire for power is there, and so they use that, and it's like a spell. So, how does Gandalf break this spell? Because Gandalf and company ride up, everyone's affected by Saruman's voice, and there's, as Saruman keeps talking, there's like this fear among everyone, like, oh my goodness, like Saruman seems to be saying the right thing, and maybe we shouldn't trust Gandalf. And then it seems that it's going to come to Gandalf entering into the tower and speaking with Saruman, and once they figure things out, everyone will be told what to do. So how does Gandalf break the spell? Well, it comes to an end like this. And this is important. Then Gandalf laughed. The fantasy vanished like a puff of smoke. And then Gandalf is able to actually gain control of Saruman with a word. He can break his staff. It seems like magic, both gaslighting and the breaking of the spell. But in real life, it's not magic. So, okay, so what are some examples of gaslighting in the Bible? There actually are quite a few, and one of them occurs in the famous story of David and Goliath. So Goliath shows up, the people of Israel, and then the Philistines line up in battle. And what does Goliath do? Well, he's big, Israel is like the halflings compared to the Boromir that is Goliath. And so he shows up morning after morning, taunting them. What is that designed to do? That is designed to strike fear into the hearts of the opponents. It's meant to make them question their cause and whether they can actually do what they're wanting to do. It diminishes their sense of moral resolve and moral courage. And so gaslighting is definitely there. But it gets deeper still, because David, of course, is this, he's this boy who shows up and thinks, I can do this. I have, skill with a sling. I've fought off animals from my sheep. But when David shows up, his older brothers who are serving in the army, what do? They actually ridicule him. To them, David seems to be up to no good. He seems to be, putting himself forward and seeking something he shouldn't. It's like the case of the kingdom of Rohan when Gandalf shows up. There's these people who, they kind of doubt his resolve. Another instance in the Bible, Hezekiah, the king of Judah, and Sennacherib. Sennacherib was the king of Assyria, and we know from historical inscription, a famous historical inscription, that Sennacherib came against Judah, and he had Hezekiah trapped like a bird in a cage, is what it says on the cylinder inscription. In the account in the Bible, Sennacherib's forces come against Hezekiah, and this messenger announces all these things, much like Goliath, intended to strike fear into them, and not without good reason. There's always good reason for a gaslighter. For Boromir, it's, you're a halfling, I'm one of the most valiant men, just let me do this. In the case of Assyria coming against Judah, they say, what nation has stood against us? Whose God has protected us, them against us? And everyone, is like, okay, you have a point. They even ask the messenger to speak to them in a language that most people won't understand, because this gaslighting has such a negative effect on the people. Hezekiah, he stands firm along with Isaiah, and they don't listen to it. Herodotus speaks of this account as well, and it's a really interesting tale of just what happens when you say no to a tyrant and the gaslighting that they will use. Okay, so recent history. Let's fast forward quite a bit here. There's a wonderful scene in the movie the movie Darkest Hour, which is about Churchill and about the challenges he faced as he stood, in many ways, feeling alone to withstand Hitler as Hitler is trying to overcome Europe. And he's talking in this one scene with Halifax. Now, Halifax is a gaslighter, but he's one of the good guys, kind of like Boromir. So Halifax says in this scene, He says, Europe is lost, and before our forces are wiped out completely, now is the time to negotiate, in order to obtain the best terms possible. Hitler will not insist on outrageous terms. He will know his own weaknesses. And then Churchill just can't stand anymore, and he says, when will the lesson be learned? And he goes on, he says, you cannot reason with a tiger when your head is in its mouth. So that's why we love Churchill, because he sees through all of that. He's like, you don't have to listen to this, Halifax. Stop it. And that's what made him such a strong leader with such strong moral resolve. Okay, so what does all this mean for you? What does all this mean for me? Well, Tolkien shows that if any of us have the capacity for an emotional desire for power or an emotional desire of self-preservation, which comes about from fear, oh, that's scary, I need to preserve myself. If any of us has this within us, then gaslighting is possible to come from us or for us to succumb to it. Tolkien shows us both realities. Well, as I look at various examples in the Bible, and as I look at the gospel as it's presented in the New Testament, it's pretty clear that the gospel is not about good and evil in the sense that make sure you're on the side of the good. The gospel is about exposing and unmasking self-justification. Boromir's great fault is not that he is a villain, okay? He is constantly throughout the story called by his comrades a valiant member and a valuable member of the fellowship. Even Boromir recognizes his own error. So it's not that he's a villain, though there is a place in the story where it says Frodo saw that he turned evil. But, like I said, he recognizes his error. So it's not that he's a villain, it's that he can't get over his need to justify his own cause as a man of Gondor and all that they stand for. It seems great, it seems right to Boromir, but it's not the way. It's not the way. So Grima is just further down the road and in different ways than Boromir was, and he is more obviously wrong. But the possibility of gaslighting exists within all of us. So, gaslighting, when you know what it is, you will start to see it everywhere. You might even see it in yourself, and hopefully you will catch it when you do. Once you know what it is, you can recognize it, and like Aragorn or others, you can not listen to it. You can even, like Gandalf, laugh at it. And when you do, you'll break the spell.